And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to walk briefly through some of the history that influenced the values of our nation. 500 years ago, politics in Europe, where the founders of our nation came from, were heavily influenced by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, a lot of political leaders at the time resented the church's influence. They saw it as a meddling foreign power. Spiritual leaders within the church, meanwhile, saw that it was in desperate need of reform. And when those spiritual leaders spoke out and tried to motivate change, the established church authorities fought their efforts. And so splinter groups, collectively known as Protestants, appeared. And when those who wanted political independence from the church realized they could have that independence and still be Christians, they broke away from the church for their own political reasons. And the result was that in countries where the leadership remained Catholic, they viewed their Protestant minority as rabble-rousers who spread disorder. In areas where the leadership was Protestant, the leadership viewed the minority who remained Catholic as traitors to a foreign power. So whichever side was in power persecuted the minority, often violently. Catholics fought Protestant nations. Protestant rulers competed with Catholic rulers for the thrones of various kingdoms. So when the late 1700s came along and the United States of America was founded, it was founded as a safe haven for people of all religious and philosophical beliefs to make a life for themselves. Laws would be established that benefited and protected all and persecuted no one. And true, we've had seasons in our history where we've fallen tragically short of that ideal, but the sincere pursuit of it has been our legacy. It's been what we stand for as a nation. And it's that ideal that soldiers sacrifice to protect. And it's the responsibility for continuing the pursuit of that ideal that our graduates are now inheriting. Now, though we need to soberly recognize our own failures as a nation, the fact that this ideal is written into the very fabric of who we are is something to be proud of. It's something to celebrate. Safety, protection, and freedom from persecution for all people, regardless of race, religion, national origin, or any other factor than character, those are noble and worthwhile values for an earthly nation to pursue. And that's why we have reason to be proud of our nation. It's why we have reason to defend our nation. According to Paul, a leader of the earliest Christians, the purpose of government is to ensure that we Christians can live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. Not just as Christians, but everyone. And as Christians, we have a responsibility to the human authority under which we live. Paul lived under the rule of the Roman Empire when he wrote this: "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be freed from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you'll be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now keep in mind that Paul was not talking about the United States of America. He was talking about the oppressive Roman Empire. He was talking, when he wrote this, about a polytheistic political power that had demonstrated hostility to Christians and Jews before them. Nevertheless, Paul is still saying that God allows human governments, even the oppressive Roman Empire, to exist in order to preserve order. He doesn't always approve of everything they do, but they exist for a purpose. As God's people, we need to cooperate the best we can with whatever human government we live under, but notice I qualified that by saying the best we can. Because we have another loyalty. We have another citizenship, one that takes precedence. Paul writes to the Philippians, "For as I have told you before, and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame. Their mind is set on earthly things. But our citizenship is in heaven. We eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so they will be like his glorious body." You see, our ultimate loyalty is to Jesus Christ. Our ultimate loyalty is to the one who's been given all authority in heaven and on earth, to the one who is called the ruler of the kings of the earth. See, occasionally, there are times when what human governments ask of us is in conflict with what Jesus commands us. In this country, that doesn't really happen that often, but it could. But here, we mainly have to be aware of what the culture, what the unwritten rules, values, and expectations of our society tell us that contradicts what Jesus teaches us. One of the greatest struggles of being a Christian is working out how this dual citizenship of ours works. How do we relate to human authorities when we're ultimately accountable to Jesus Christ? How do we participate in society without letting the culture influence us more than Jesus influenced us? God's people have struggled with these questions before. Let's look at a couple of examples from different points in biblical history. First, let's look at the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. This is about 600 years before Jesus was born. Back then, God's people made up the kingdom of Judah. Judah was conquered by the Babylonian Empire. Their capital was destroyed. Their king and his family were executed. And their people were removed from their homeland and taken to Babylon, which is in present-day Iraq. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar recruited young men from some of the royal and noble houses of Judah. He gave them an education, put them through a training program to become his advisors. And among them was a man named Daniel. Now, all the men going through this training were to receive food and wine from the king's table. But as good Jews, Daniel and his friends followed the dietary restrictions laid out in the law of Moses. There was no way for them to know whether or not these dietary laws had been followed by the king's cooks. So Daniel asked the Roman official who was overseeing the training program for permission to stick with just water and vegetables. That way he and his fellow Jews wouldn't be at risk for violating the law of Moses. Well, Daniel and his friends would go on to have successful careers in the king's palace. According to Daniel's own writing, it says, "At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom." So what do we see here? Daniel and his friends held tightly to their beliefs, even in the face of cultural pressure and even official policy. They didn't compromise their way of life, neither did they impose their way of life on anyone else. Furthermore, even though they were pressed into service of a foreign king who worshipped false gods, they still served that kingdom as faithfully as they could without violating what they believed God expected of them. In Daniel 3, we see this again. Daniel's friends get in trouble for not worshiping a statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. You see, they served the king faithfully up to a point, but they took a stand when they were required to disobey God. In Daniel 6, Daniel himself obeys a royal edict that no one could pray to any god except Nebuchadnezzar himself. Once again, we see Daniel being a faithful servant of a foreign, godless king up to a point. So what do we learn from Daniel and his friends about our dual citizenship? Well, first of all, we should do good for our community, nation, and world, even for those we disagree with. We shouldn't impose what we believe on those who disagree. Now let me make it clear, when I refer to imposing what we believe, I mean forcing people who aren't Christians to live as though they were. What I don't mean is simply sharing what we believe. Sharing what we believe is not imposing what we believe on others. Imposing what we believe on others is forcing people to live as Christians when they aren't. We should also never give in to pressure to abandon God's expectations. Now, we might want to take a moment to consider whether or not we're mistaken about God's expectations. We Christians have misinterpreted the Bible before, so occasionally our positions need some revision. And after honestly evaluating our position, if we're confident that we're being faithful, we should hold tightly to what we believe. Let's look at another example, this time from the New Testament. Daniel lived 600 years before Jesus, but now let's talk about something that happened a few months after Jesus died on the cross. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish ruling council in Jerusalem, and Rome delegated to them the task of enforcing Jewish religious law. They were the ones who had declared Jesus a blasphemer and handed him over to the Romans to be crucified. That's who the Sanhedrin was. And when the disciples started announcing that Jesus had risen from the dead, teaching that he was the Messiah, and performing miracles in his name, you can imagine that the Sanhedrin wasn't thrilled about that. They had Peter and John brought before them, and they commanded them to stop teaching about Jesus in public. Now keep in mind what Jesus told them in Matthew 23. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. Jesus taught his disciples to respect their religious leaders' positions under normal circumstances. But clearly this was a different situation, because Peter replied to their ban on teaching about Jesus like this: which is right in God's eyes? To listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we've seen and heard. Later on, Peter would get in trouble again with the same group for the same thing. He would tell them flat out, we must obey God rather than human beings. So here again, we see that God's authority takes precedence over any human authority or social pressure. One last example, this one from the teachings of Jesus. Once Jesus was asked if he and his fellow Jews should pay taxes to Caesar, to the emperor, the Roman emperor. It was a trap, by the way. The Jewish people, by and large, believed that Roman taxes were a sign of oppressive foreign rule. To say that they should pay taxes to Rome would have made him very unpopular with his fellow Jews. On the other hand, saying that they shouldn't pay would have gotten him in trouble with the local Roman authorities. So Jesus was pretty well stuck. But he called attention to the fact that the emperor's portrait was on the coin, and he famously answered, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. See, what we owe Caesar, what we owe our government and our society, is our contribution to law and order. We contribute by being law-abiding citizens, by paying our taxes, and because we live in a representative democracy, by voting. Some of us are called upon to serve as public servants in public office, and yes, in the military. That's what we owe Caesar. But what we owe God is our very hearts. What we owe God is our devotion lived out every day. Now, we honor God when we contribute to law and order in our society, including when we live at peace with those with whom we disagree. But when society influences us or calls upon us to abandon what we believe to be God's ways, we must remain firm as Daniel did, as Peter and John did. The United States is in many ways the safe haven for diverse peoples that it was meant to be, at least officially. And that is a legacy worth living for and, if necessary, dying for. But we must always remember that we have a dual citizenship. Our citizenship in the United States lasts only a lifetime, and our citizenship in the kingdom will last